Again, for those who are still coming in joining us for tonight's opening African American Black History Month lecture, as hosted by the Michigan Street African American Heritage Corridor Commission, we will be starting momentarily. But in the meantime, we kindly ask that you mute yourselves so that we don't get background noise. Thank you very much. So good evening, everyone. Uh, Before we start, again, I will remind for all those who are participating in tonight's Black History Month lecture series, our first one tonight, that you kindly mute yourselves and keep yourselves muted throughout the presentation, just as a courtesy to our lecturers and as a means of making sure that we have a pleasant lecture whereby everyone can hear and participate. So I'm Alfred. I am the executive director of the Michigan Street African American Heritage Corridor Commission. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome you to the first of our commission's Black History Month lecture series. As an advocate of the community, the Heritage Corridor Commission endeavors to integrate the African American cultural significance and impact on the city of Buffalo's history through public engagement, community education that will invigorate, inspire, and enliven cultural appreciation, preservation, and community development. The commission serves as the connector of the past, present, and future for historic neighborhoods within the corridor. Tonight's lecture fully exemplifies the finest elements of our mission and vision. Many of us know that Jesse Wallace Clipper was the first African American soldier from Buffalo to die in World War One. But who was Jesse Clipper the man? Where was he born? Who and what were his loves? And how and why did he attack? Hopefully would answer the. Tonight's lecture will be led by two local experts about Jesse Clipper, who I have great respect for. Diane L. Cookfair, PhD, is a clinical researcher and research consultant specializing in the design and analysis of clinical trials. She holds a volunteer appointment as a clinical assistant professor of neurology at Jacobs School of Medicine and Biomedical Sciences and the University of Buffalo. And the Reverend Eugene L. Pierce is a veteran and both a past and current commander of Jesse Clipper American Legion Post number 430. Following his honorable discharge from the United States Army in 1964, he served in the New York Air National Guard, Army National Guard, and the Army Reserves until 1990. I'm quite excited to inform you that a comprehensive article about Jesse Clipper written by Diane Cookfair with significant contributions to the article provided by Reverend and Commander Pierce has been accepted and is featured in the winter 2022 edition of the Western New York Heritage Magazine. And before I go further, I'd like to take this opportunity to also introduce Audrey Clark, who is the Commission's project manager. She will be flipping the slides, as you will, for our lecturers. So without further ado, it's my honor to introduce Dr. Diane Cookfair.
Hi, everyone. shows the, you just heard Terry Alford talking about the Western New York Heritage magazine that's coming out. And if anyone who's on, Cheryl, can you mute your screen? For anyone who's wondering, thanks. This is the magazine that's just come out, an issue of Western New York Heritage, which is a quarterly magazine. And you'll note here that my co-authors include Terry Alford, who just introduced us, Reverend Eugene Pierce, who's my co-presenter tonight, and Craig R. Steger, who has helped me throughout this entire 12 years that I've been doing this research, and also helped with the writing and editing of the article that's in Western New York Heritage. He also happens to be my husband. So, and I want to thank the assistant editor at Western New York Heritage, who made this special offer for those who would like to perhaps subscribe to the journal, which is use this promo code and it will be repeated at the end of the talk, and you can get a free copy, or not a free, excuse me, discounted subscription to the journal. Could we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so the other person I want to make a brief acknowledgement of is, if she's here, and even if she's not, is I want to give a shout out to Deborah Ransom, who was the commander of the Jesse Clipper Post back in 2010, when I was first really beginning to research this, and she encouraged me to keep going, so I did. Next slide, please. Okay, so what do we know about Jesse Clipper? What have we read? You know, the usual things. He was the first African-American from Buffalo to die in World War I. He was living in Buffalo by 1915, working as a waiter. He married Edna Mercer in 1916. He was then employed at the American Palace Laundry when World War I started. A lot of people have heard that he was vice president of Local 533, which is the 8th Black standalone American Federation of Musicians Union in the United States. And it's commonly thought that he was drafted. In fact, an 1968 article in the news said he was drafted. He served in the 317th Combat Engineer Regiment of the 92nd Division, and he died on February 21st, 1919, and he's buried in the Oisy-Esna American Cemetery in France. And that's pretty much everything we've seen in one form or another. Next slide, please. So what is this real story? First of all, Jesse Wallace Clipper was born in Salt Lake City, Utah in April in 1882. And before I go further down this list, I'm going to mention, someone asked me, what got you started doing this research? And what got me started is I had a goddaughter who was fairly young. I was taking her to a doctor's appointment at Children's. We did some errands. We drove past Jesse Clipper Park downtown. And she said to me, as kids do, "What's that?" And I said, well, that's Jesse Clipper Park. And then, of course, who's Jesse Clipper? And so I said, well, he was a soldier and he was a musician and he was a hero. And he died in 1990, almost 100 years ago. And he was a musician. And of course, what she remembered, I said, like your daddy, because her father is a musician. And so she immediately said, what instrument did he play? And I could not answer her question. And just to let you know, she's now in college, and this mug, which says 2009, is something she and her mom got me when they went to Disneyland in 2009. So that gives you a sense of how long I've been working on this part-time as I had the time. And so here's the headliners of what I found. He was the son and grandson of former slaves. He appeared in his first professional vaudeville show at the age of 10. He lived in various cities on the West Coast until he was 28 years old. Edna Mercer, who was his third wife, who he married here in Buffalo, not his first. Jesse and his second wife, Della, were nationally known vaudeville stars. And Jesse Clipper moved to Buffalo following the death of his second wife, Della. And the biggie is that I discovered is that Jesse Clipper was not drafted. He enlisted at the age of 35. Now, being a researcher, this immediately got me curious, especially when I figured out he had been born in Utah, which was an uncommon place. And during World War II, the draft was limited to people men between the ages of 21 and 31. So he was too old to be drafted. And he also, he was in Buffalo, so he would have been counted as Buffalo. But also there's another fact. The war is declared the first week in April of 1917. And Clipper, 20,000 African Americans joined during that first week. And after that, the Army stopped allowing the enlistment of African Americans and limited their participation to the draft. So it is not surprising that people assume that he was drafted. So can we go to the next slide, please? Naturally, I wondered what his story was. And even though by the time I found the answer to what instrument did he play, it was the trombone, by the way. Many years later, I just got fascinated by this story and I started to investigate. And the more I found out, the more interesting it became. So we'll start by just mentioning briefly the family tree, because you'll hear me mention a few names. Jesse Clipper had, he has grandparents. Oh, let's see. Audrey, can you move back one slide to just a slide before this one? Okay, if anyone's wondering where I found these various sources, state and federal census records, voter registration records, city directories, marriage licenses, Google, and especially once I figured out where he had lived, historical newspapers. And we are fortunate that his name was Clipper and he was born in Utah, because it made it a lot easier to match his name with sources. If his last name had been Jones or Smith, we wouldn't be having this lecture tonight, at least not given by me. Okay, so back to that next slide then, Audrey. Thank you. Jesse Clipper's family tree is sort of important to this story because it's one of the ways I was able to find him. First, there are his grandparents, and you'll notice that his grandfather's name was also Jesse. And he was born in 1833, died in 1899, and his grandmother. And Jesse and his mother lived with, and her husband, at least until they separated, lived with the Thomases and moved with them to various areas. So, and Lizzie Thomas was one of three girls, the youngest in the family, and she was born 2 years after emancipation and the only member of the family to be born at that time. How did they end up in the West? Well, we'll get to that, but basically, Jesse Thomas left Missouri, where he'd been a slave, and took his family then, before Jesse was born, to Omaha, Nebraska, where he found work as a laborer on the railroads. And eventually, within a few years, he took a job as a porter. Lizzie Thomas's daughter eventually married William Clipper, who had been born in Alabama and who was Jesse's father. They moved from Omaha, the entire Thomas and Clipper clan moved to Salt Lake City, Utah, again, a railroad town, where Jesse was born in April of 1882. And his only sibling, Richard Ulysses Clipper, his little brother, was born in Denver a few years later. Next slide, please. Now, this is this is a little convoluted, but it shows the movements and the places that first Jesse's grandparents lived. If you start with the green dots in Missouri and you follow to Nebraska, you can tell where the green is where the grandparents lived and moved with Jesse's mom. And they moved to Utah. Okay, they moved to Utah, where you see the blue dots start. And that's where Jesse was born. They moved from there to Colorado, to Denver, where his brother was born in 1885. And then in about 1887, the family moved to Portland, Oregon. From there, they moved to Oakland, California. And those two dots there, I've only had room for two arrows, but there were times when they lived in Oakland, and there were times when they lived in the town next door, Stockton. The other place he lived as a young man or as a teenager was Hanford, California, which is the lowest blue dot in California. And he moved back to the Oakland area. And then he was performing, and that's where he first married, moved up to the state of Washington. And eventually they moved to Chicago, to New York City, and finally to Buffalo, where we picked up his trail. So we'll come back to some of this, but this is just to give you kind of a framework. Next slide, please. Okay, so some interesting things about Clipper and why nobody thought originally to look for him in Utah. In 1880, Utah was still a territory. It only had 142,423 white residents and 232 black residents, and that was in the entire territory of Utah. They did not register births because, of course, Utah was a Mormon territory, and polygamy was still legal at the time that that Jesse's family moved to Utah. And so that was one of the things holding up them becoming a state. And there were still a few people that they were gradually getting people to give up this whole idea of polygamy, but there were still a few people who'd been married before, and they really didn't want the rest of the world knowing how many births per family there was. So they avoided birth certificates. So you won't find a birth certificate for Jesse Clipper. So I was curious as to how many black children were born in Utah during that time period. I looked at the 1900 US Census in Ancestry, and I did a search for all black children born in the territory of Utah in 1882, living anywhere in the United States who were still alive in 1900. And there were only 7 black children born in 1882 in the territory of Utah. So right from the very beginning, Jesse was a one of a kind. So let's move on. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so when he was living in Portland, just to give you a sense of what things were like, this is a view taken during 1888 of Portland. You can see the streetcars are drawn by horses in the mud. And this is the sort of thing that Jesse, as a young boy, would have seen in Portland. Next slide, please. Now, they then moved, when they moved to Hanford in the 1890s, there were only about 2,900, a little over 2,900 people living in Hanford, and only 53 of them were African Americans. And this is a picture of the Hanford Opera House taken around the time that Jesse lived there. And he and his brother were well known in Hanford as children who did entertainment. And there's an article from the paper there. And I want you to understand that if you see the language that's used in this particular article, this is not my language. And I thought long and hard about putting it here because there were 2 different newspapers in Hanford. They were both white owned, but they tended to report things a little differently in their language. And one of the things you have to remember is that not only did African Americans head west after the Civil War to find work and a better chance at life, so did a number of Southerners who'd been part of the Confederacy and had believed very much in the values of the Confederate South. And they took those attitudes with them, and they taught them to their children and grandchildren. And so in one of the papers, those attitudes came out, even when they were saying something about, like, Dick and Jesse Clipper could sing and dance so well. And they were not allowed to be in this community theater performance. They were the entertainment at the intermission. Even that was rare. Okay, next slide, please. And here's another view that when in 1900 in Hartford, when Jesse Clipper was working as a messenger boy at a hotel, he was in a building that was right around the corner from this address. And this is the sort of scene he would have seen every day, to put in perspective what things were like out there in the West. Next slide, please. So, you wonder about Clipper and what kind of a man he was, what kind of a kid he was, and whether he was always the kind of man who would do heroic things. And this newspaper article from 1900 tells a story. And if you look at the headline on the other side, you say the subheading is how the butt end of a buggy whip in the hands of a colored boy prevented a murder being committed. And in the article, about a little more than halfway down, you see the name Jesse Clipper. A man, his mother had separated from her first husband, Jesse's father, and remarried a man named Charles Moore, who doesn't sound like he was particularly pleasant. And this was 1900. Jesse's grandfather had just died, and I think that may have influenced her choice of men, or maybe lack of choice. He didn't sound, from the things I read about his trial, like he was a particularly pleasant man. And he also sounded like he wasn't a good guy to be around when he was drunk, and Jesse clearly knew that. An altercation occurred outside their house, and Moore, who was the last name, Jesse Clipper, who was Moore's stepson, saw the attack, saw that his stepfather was about to stab a man who'd just gotten off his buggy to talk to him. And he jumped in, grabbed the buggy whip from the other man's horse cart, and took the handle end and hit Moore over the head with it. And they credit with him with probably preventing the man from being murdered. I will mention that he went on to testify against his stepfather in a trial, and he had to know that this could come back to haunt him, given the kind of man. And Moore was ultimately convicted and spent a year or two in jail. Okay, next slide, please. So this is significant because it has a little something to do with how Jesse Clipper got into the military. This is the Polytechnic Business College and School of Engineering. And in 1901, it had just really started up a few years before. It was a freestanding college that specialized in just a couple of things. And they had everything from certificate programs that lasted 6 months to college degrees of up to 2 years. And we know that Clipper attended this college in 1901. We don't know how long he was there. We don't know what courses he took. The college is long since closed. And we don't know what degree he got. We just know he was there in the spring of 1901. And this is a picture of the college at about that time, and one of the advertisements that they used to put in journals to attract people. Okay, next slide, please. So this is just a little number. You can tell that people in Lemoore, the neighboring town, and Hartford knew these folks. This is a thing that shows that Jesse and Dick, when they were late teens to early 20s, had gotten a chance to go, and they had auditioned to be in Mccandless, Alabama Warblers, which was a minstrel troupe that included young men and young women that toured by wagon in the minstrel tents from town to town in the West and in Canada during summer. So they spent some time in that group. Next slide, please. Okay, so fast forward to 1905, when Jesse Clipper was living in Stockton, California, and he met and married 16-year-old Lillian Carson, who was also from Stockton. We don't have a picture of her, but we do have this marriage license and a few more things. Could we, next slide, please? Things weren't easy for them. The Seattle Star had this headline in this paper in September of 1907, where Seattle was where Jesse and his first wife they had rented a room, and Jesse was performing at probably at local, knowing the Seattle scene at that time, probably in local taverns, other places, working as a vocalist. And they had taken a room at a place called the Eagle House. And what the newspaper revealed is that a man named Everett St. Clair chased another woman, another Black woman named Ruby Burns, down the street one night in her nightclothes. And I read a few other articles. He came off as sort of an obsessive type who was stalking her. And she ran to the building where Jesse and Lillian were staying. And Ruby Burns had made her way to Lillian's room and taken refuge there, figuring she'd be safe, but she wasn't. St. Clair burst into the room. He stabbed both women. And this was about the point, according to the newspaper, that Jesse Clipper broke into the room and floored the would-be murderer with a stinging blow to the face. So they mentioned that he was ripping Clipper's vest in several places, which probably means that Jesse was coming home from work, because of course they'd wear a vest if he was performing at a tavern or someplace else. And Clipper was unarmed. However, he managed to stop the man, and he was arrested, and the two women were taken to the Wayside Emergency Hospital. Okay, next slide, please. And here's another little thing here that I thought I'd mention. The Jim Crow laws of Seattle at that time meant that in order to testify against Everett St. Clair in court, Jesse had to, as a Black man, had to pay a bail of $100 just to appear as a witness at the trial. And in today's dollars, that would be about $3,000. So even to appear as a witness, which he did, he had to spend a lot of money. And St. Clair was ultimately convicted of assault and sent to prison. We have the next slide, please. Unfortunately, it did not have a happy ending. Lillian Clipper, she died at the county hospital on September 21st, 1908. And while her death was a result of tuberculosis, the doctor said that the end was hastened by the wounds inflicted by St. Clair. So despite everything he tried to do, he lost his first wife, and she was just 2 weeks short of her 19th birthday at the time. Next slide, please. This is the point at which he moved to Seattle and began to perform with a young woman from Tacoma. He moved from Seattle to Tacoma, began to perform with a young woman named Della Tanner. And they were quite good together, but there wasn't a lot of work on the West Coast for them. They knew they'd need to move on, and you didn't travel anywhere with a man and a woman didn't travel places unless they were related. They either had to be siblings or they had to be married. So on October 3rd, 1909, Jesse and Della were married, and her father and stepmother were the witnesses there. So next slide, please. Okay, so this is a picture of a publicity shot that was made in about 1910 of Jesse's second wife, Della, and they nicknamed her Fox Clipper. Okay. Next slide, please. So they moved to Chicago in 1910. They began to tour Black Vaudeville's Midwest circuit using Chicago as their home base. And after they played that circuit for a while, and it was pretty intensive touring, they moved to New York City and made their debut at the New York's Crescent Theater on December 5th, 1911. Over the next year, they made a big splash. They continued to just tour intensively in the Northeast. They were now headliners and generally had standing room only crowds wherever they performed. Next slide, please. Okay, here's an ad that they put in the New York Age that they took out shortly for Christmas. A number of the stars would put announcements wishing all of their fans a Merry Christmas. And they took out a 8-page ad. I apologize for the contrast here, but this is 100-year-old newspaper clippings that were scanned in by someone other than myself quite a while ago. So next slide, please. Now, why were people interested in them? And these two quotes, I think, really describe what they had going for them. The Chicago Defender, Sylvester Russell, was the critic for the Chicago Defender, and he said, people turned away at the Monogram, which is where they were performing, and he said there was a good reason for the crowds that congested the doorway at the Monogram. Jessie and Della Clipper had returned, and the man with the magnificent voice again made musical and comedy love to his pretty little wife who had threatened to forsake him. The change from despair to warmth of happiness, Miss Clipper's good acting, and her husband's grotesque comical finish was the main cause. And that gives you a sense of what kind of chemistry they had in their act, because Sylvester Russell could be fairly critical in his reviews. And then we have in 1912.
Ridiculous, allergic to pineapples, like I can't with my life.
Okay, in 1912, the New York Age, which was another major newspaper of the time that had national circulation, African-American newspaper, was talking about a minstrel show given by an organization called the Frogs, which was sort of an elite organization for men, theatrical professionals, and for others. So other professional men. It was males only. It was a boys club, African Americans, and Clipper eventually was in it. But once a year, they gave a large minstrel show, which was sort of a big night, big entertainment night in Harlem. So here's what Lester Walton had to say. He talked about how Monday evening, the Frogs minstrel show, and this is a much longer article. I've just clipped the part that dealt with Clipper. It says, then came Jesse Clipper of the Clippers, who is considered by many as the next comedian to head a colored show. He meant a Broadway show. Clipper sang Ragtime Violin, which had just come out, by the way. And the more he sang and danced, the more the audience applauded. He was compelled to sit down from sheer exhaustion after responding to several encores. So, next slide, please. So, and here's another picture of the Clippers, who the headline that's cut off here reads, Della Fox and Jesse, who have been booked solid since their Eastern debut last December. Okay, next slide. And this is the Frogs. There were some fairly well-known African-American figures in this. You see Lester Walton, who was the critic for the Times and went on to be the ambassador to Liberia. You see George Walker, who was one of the most famous Broadway people, and others. Okay, so, and in this article, the Frogs are holding an entertainment night, and one of the people who was on the invitation is Jesse Clipper, which is down in the last paragraph. Okay, next slide, please. And the other thing is they did a lot of fundraising, because of course there was no insurance. People in vaudeville got sick, so they would do fundraising. Ada Overton Walker, who was one of the most famous performers of her time, not just she was the first lady of African American theater, and she also is credited with being a founder of modern jazz dance. So you can see that they are on the bill with her, and they knew her fairly well. Next slide, please. So they kept up their hectic touring schedule until towards the end of 1913, and Della became sick. We moved down, and Jessie was off stage for quite a while with her, but she didn't get better, and I don't know what she died of. I only know that she died of natural causes, and that she managed during the last few weeks of her life to get home to her parents in Tacoma, Washington. And when she died in November of 1914, she was 23 years old. Next slide, please. So after Della's death, Jesse turned his back on vaudeville. He could have gone on to be an independent star. He was well-connected, well-known, but for whatever reason, he didn't feel he could do it without his wife. And he was, I think that when he moved here, he was kind of not probably doing all well, because he just turned his back and left. He came to Buffalo and he started to rebuild his shattered life. In 1915, when he came to Buffalo and was first working as a waiter and then at a laundry, this was the first as the actors would say, straight job that he'd had in 10 years. Before that, he'd been earning his living entertaining. So now, he started to put down roots in Buffalo. In October of 1916, he married Edna Mercer. He started putting together his own musical groups, performing various local venues part-time. And he helped form the local union for African Americans who were not eligible to join the whites-only union. And that was the American Federation of Musicians, Local 533, and was elected vice president of that union for 1918. Next slide, please. Okay, so you see here the program. The officers were installed on February 7th, 1918, and he's the second name on the list there. Next slide, please. April 6, 1917, the U.S. had declared war against Germany. And as I said, the Army had stopped taking Black volunteers within 1 week. And so most people assumed that Clipper was drafted, but he was too old. So at the time of the draft, he was nearly 36 years old. So how did he manage to enlist? He answered an ad in the newspaper. Next slide, please. Late in December, selected newspapers announced that the Army Corps of Engineers was looking for additional African Americans to serve in the 317th Combat Engineer Regiment of the 92nd Division. They wanted men who had attended college and or had trained in the engineering trades, and they would take at least a limited number of volunteers who met their criteria. And anyone interested should write, and they told you where to write. Well, you remember that part where I showed you the colleges, the college that he briefly attended? My suspicion is that Clipper took business classes. We don't know this, but he knew a lot about marketing and he was in entertainment. But the title did say Business College and School of Engineering, and Clipper knew how to audition for a position. So he made the decision to try to enlist, and he was called up. And he was formally enlisted in Columbus, Ohio on February 27th, 1918. And I should note here that the 2,500-man engineer regiment that was ultimately formed had 1,891 draftees and 352 volunteers, and one of those volunteers was Clipper. Next slide, please. And here is this shows Clipper, and I've cut off part of this so it would fit on the slide. If you look at the very bottom, you see Clipper Jesse, 317th, his wife's name. At that point, they were living briefly on William Street, or she was, and they were departing from Hoboken, New Jersey on June 7th, 1918, aboard the ship Aeolus. Next slide, please. And this is his military service card. And if you look at the upper part, this is the other thing that shows that he enlisted. On the various cards, they would cross off the parts that did not apply. And if you look down just below his name, you see enlisted, and that's not crossed off, and you see NA, National Army, written in. And then on the other, at the far end of that line, you see inducted. If a man was drafted, everything else would be crossed off, and the word inducted would not be crossed off. So we show here what company he was in, that he was promoted to corporal on August 27th, 1918, and that he died of pleurisy and pneumonia on February 21st. The only thing here that's different from every other record I found is that when he applied, he seems to have shaved just a year or two off of his age. And I don't know this for sure, but my suspicion is he felt that he would be more likely to be accepted if he was just a little younger. Next slide, please. Okay, we can go to the next one. Audrey, next slide. This is just a brief picture to give you an idea of how separate the two forces tended to be. If you look at the tension, this was one of those rare things where African-American troops and white troops had to work together. And this is not something they were used to. Next slide, please. Okay, so briefly, and then I'm going to turn things over to Reverend Pierce. In July, the Army Corps of Engineers replaced all of the 317th Black officers with white officers. Clipper was promoted to the rank of corporal on August 27, 1918. And the job of combat engineer was one of the most dangerous you could have during World War I, no matter what unit you were in. because they were the ones that made it possible for the Army to move forward. They repaired roads, they both blew up and built bridges, they repaired and built railroads. They were frequently working at the front or beyond it. And so they were, if you stopped the combat engineers, you stopped the Army. So they were the target. Routinely, they worked as a target of artillery fire, machine gun, gas attacks, and there were casualties, one of whom was Jesse Clipper. The reports we've read said that he was wounded, hospitalized, recovered, and returned to his unit. Next slide. Next slide, Audrey. So towards the end of the war, he was injured in a gas attack. And something people should be aware of is that lungs that are severely injured by gas are very susceptible to infection. He didn't have to catch influenza to die. A common cold, if his lungs were badly enough damaged, could do it. So he died of pleurisy and pneumonia on February 21st, 1919, just 4 days before the rest of his regiment sailed for home. And he's buried in the Razé-Aisne American Cemetery in France. Next slide, please. At this point, I'm going to turn things over to Reverend Pierce, who's going to tell us about the story in current times. Reverend Pierce. Okay. Reverend Pierce, if you want to unmute.
Reverend Pierce, you have to unmute.
How's that?
That's good.
I'm loud and clear? Great. Okay, if you would remove that slide, please. I just like to make some remarks. I'm waiting now. I'm down at the bottom. Am I okay? Well, okay, I would like to first thank Mr. Alford for including Jesse Clipper in the series. It's very, very wonderful. And also, I want to thank Dr. Cookfair, as well as her husband, Craig Steger, for the research, 10 years or more of research into the lives of Jesse Clipper. Now, as for myself, I'm the retired deputy superintendent of the Erie County Correctional Facility. I was drafted into the Army in 1958. I attended basic training at Fort Hood, Texas. My fellow trainee was Elvis Presley. And what was unique was the fact that as we talked, Elvis was from Tupelo, Mississippi, and he had relocated to Memphis, Tennessee. I'm from Laurel, Mississippi, and I had relocated to Buffalo, New York. Now, I served 3 years in Gelnhausen, Germany. One of my company commanders was First Lieutenant Colin Powell, who was on his first assignment after graduation from the ROTC program at New York City College. Now, his sister Marilyn was 3 years older than he, and she attended Buffalo State College. Before my honorable discharge, I had 18 and a half years of military service, including 6 years active, Army National Guard, Air National Guard, and Army Reserves. In planning the trip to Germany and France in 2017, my purpose was to attend the promotional ceremony in Simbach, Germany, for my nephew, Pierre Pierce, an Army dentist, from Major to Lieutenant Colonel. My brother, Bobby Pierce, was visiting Germany also. He's from New Orleans. Now, after the promotional ceremony, the three of us traveled 200 miles to Nacelle, France, 70 miles south of Paris, the location of the American Cemetery Monument where Jesse Clipper was buried. I expected there might be a question as to Jesse's first name. Some spelled it Jesse and some spelled itJessie. But when I inquired at the Welcome Center, I asked the receptionist that I was there to visit the gravesite of Jesse Clipper. I was shocked when I was informed that there was no veteran named Jesse Clipper buried there. I had seen a picture previously of a cross in the cemetery with the name Jesse Clipper on it. So I inquired, and let's have that slide there, if you will. I inquired about how could this happen? There was no veteran by the name of Jesse Clipper buried at the cemetery. And the receptionist showed me this list. And it shows they have a James Clipper buried there, no Jesse Clipper. And James Clipper was from New York. The receptionist assumed that he was from New York City. I said, no, I have a picture. And the picture shows that Jesse Clipper, Jesse Clipper, is buried here. And I have the location of the plot. The receptionist says, well, look at the master list. This comes from Arlington Cemetery in Virginia. We don't do this. So I know he's not buried there. She was very adamant. As a matter of fact, she said, chances are he's buried at one cemetery, one of those down near Normandy Beach, down around Le Havre and Rouen. And that's another 200 miles south to get to the Mediterranean Sea. So, I mean, the English Channel. So I said, no, I tell you what. I said, will you do this for me? Let me have escorts and take me to this location. Plot B, row 28, grave 6. I want to see that cross. I want to see that burial site. So the escort escorted the three of us down to this site. Can I have a slide, please? The other slide. And here I am pictured in the cemetery. I'm among, okay, that's good. I'm among 6,200 soldiers and Marines that are buried at this site. And it's very significant because the battles was great there, because had they lost this area, the German forces was clear to move on into Paris. So they prevented the attack against Paris. And there's a picture here. Try and put it up. This is a picture of the grave marker. There it is. This is the picture that was the marker on Jesse Clipper's grave. It reads, Jesse W. Clipper, Corporal, U.S. Army. And I just could not understand how this could happen. But you look around the cemetery, I want to say it's well kept. And there are some clips here of the cemetery. Go right ahead. Go ahead. Another one.
It's an honor to be
Not
here.
that one. Yeah. Okay, that's okay. Go ahead.
At the gravesite of our namesake in the Jesse Clipper post, Jesse W. Clipper. And I'd just like to read a couple words from the Lord. Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it was not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you, and if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And where I go, you know, and the way will be clear. But Thomas said unto him, Lord, we know not where you goeth, and how can we know the way? Jesus said unto him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. Today, O God, I pray and I thank you for receiving the soul of Jesse Clipper into your kingdom, and that it's my prayer that as we continue the mission of the American Legion Jesse Clipper Post, we will do it in a way to make Jesse Clipper proud. This I pray in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Thank you so much. And let us show the slides of, this is the main gate, coming into the main gate of the cemetery. Next slide, please. And as you see, it's a massive cemetery monument. We have 6,200 soldiers and Marines buried at this site. Next slide. And one of the requirements is that those visiting must sign the book. And as I signed the guest book, the receptionist said to me, it's not every day that we have someone coming to visit their namesake. And we're proud of it. It was apologized to me that something like this could happen. It was unbelievable. And the superintendent of the cemetery called me before I left Germany, and he apologized that something like this could happen at that cemetery. And I asked him a question. I says, well, he was buried in 1919. This is 2017. That's 98 years ago. He said, yes, that's sad. But I'm afraid if you had not come when you did, it would have been much longer. So getting back to the States, I couldn't wait to log in to the cemetery site. And I logged in Jesse Clipper. And yes, Jesse Clipper is official now. He has a name, he has a burial site. Glory to God. Thank you.
Amen. Amen. Well, first of all, thank you to Dr. Cookfair, as well as to the Reverend and Commander Eugene Pierce. And before I go on, we start entertaining questions. I saw in the chat box and was kindly reminded that we thank you for your service, Reverend, as well as we thank all the men and women that comprise the Jesse Clipper American Legion Post number 430 for their service as well. And your continued sacrifices that you make for all of us and for our country. I know as we were listening to the presentation that Audrey continued to encourage and remind you that if you have any questions, we will entertain them at this time. To make it easier and a little more orderly, we ask that if you have questions, that you simply type into the chat box. If you scroll down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a box there that says chat. If you click on that, it'll open up to a window and you can easily just type in your question and we'll take them as they come in. Okay. So as we wait for questions, the privilege that I have is, if I call myself a moderator for this presentation, is I get to ask the first couple of questions. So I'm going to start with Diane, Dr. Cookfair. You mentioned one of Jesse Clipper's wives, his third wife that he met in Buffalo. Could you maybe, do you know, or could you tell us the circumstances in terms of what led to their meeting? Where did he meet her? And was she also in the entertainment world?
In the world, his marriage to her was a little different than the others. You know, they weren't just living in rooming houses and moving from place to place. They had physical addresses where they rented an apartment, you know, and they weren't living out of suitcases. I'm not absolutely certain where they met. I know they were married in a church, but she stayed here. And, you know, in many respects, she knew him less time than the time that passed afterwards. You know, I know some of you know that in 1930, the newspaper mentioned that they had the Gold Stars, widows and mothers who were invited to go to Europe to visit the graves. I found no evidence that she'd ever gone. And at that point, she had known him for less time than she had been his widow. And, you know, I think it wasn't an easy thing for her. That's not a complete answer, and I'll let you know if I can figure out more. She never remarried, but it did look from the census records and directories like she found companionship with another person who I believe was a veteran. And they eventually moved to Cleveland, Ohio around 1935.
Thank you. The next question we received is from Gail Wells. And her question is, or observation is, the post should be relocated to the quarter and should be invited to join the commission. What needs to be done to facilitate this? If I may, I can answer that question. We have been talking for a while now with the Reverend Commander Eugene Pierce, as well as with other members throughout the year that represents the post themselves. So we do have a strategic action plan that's going to be soon presented, actually next week. I would encourage you to participate in that as well. That's going to happen next Thursday at 6 o'clock, virtually on Zoom, on Thursday, February 10th. But to answer your question specifically, Gail, we continue to have these conversations with Reverend Pierce. My hope is as we move forward, we can, with him and the board, we can work effectively together to maybe talk about solutions in terms of how to make all that happen. When I came on board and I was talking to the board that eventually hired me, that was one of the things that was specifically talked about, the vision and the dream of the post actually having a brick and mortar one day. So we are taking that seriously. It entails a lot of conversation and a lot of planning as well. Hopefully that answers your question. Next question that I see here is from, hopefully I don't mispronounce your name, Jare Cardinal. It says here, thank you for this great presentation. Did you do any research about the neighborhood where Jesse lived when he enlisted? The only Potter I can find is in South Buffalo.
It was the answer that someone else typed in here is absolutely correct. It eventually was renamed Nash Street. And in fact, Potter Street and the address on which Clipper lived at right after he got married was first in an apartment that was probably a couple of doors away from the house in which Reverend Nash and his wife lived a few years later. That's now the Nash house. The house that he would have been in has been torn down at this point. So there's a lot of streets in Buffalo that have changed names over the years. So you have to really look.
Very good. Directed to the Reverend and Commander Pierce. What are the present activities of the Jesse Clipper American Legion post? And in addition to that question, how do you see the community better supporting the post and its activities in the coming months and years?
Well, I think that having the program tonight, the lecture, will create the climate and make the community more aware of the need for a Jesse Clipper post, a physical site. And the person heading our job, our facility search is the city controller, one of our members, one of our own, Controller Barbara Miller Williams. She chairs the facility search, and we'll be getting together more often on that. And also our post, instead of now being a colored post, we are an American Legion post with African Americans, white members. Our post is composed of elected officials, clergy, male and female. So we have the combination and the desire to do great things. And going down Genesee Street, at one time, the post, Benny Wells, not Benny Wells, Jesse Clipper Post owned the building at 425 Genesee Street. And it almost took up a block. And it was a center of youth activity. We had a basketball team, a bowling team. We had a drum and bugle corps. It was a center of attraction. And driving down Genesee now, and Genesee Street, and you look for 425, it's not there. It's just a vacant land. But somehow, some way, we're going to be able to recreate. Why? Because there's a need. There's a great need, not only to serve our young men, but our young women too. Presently, the post provides services such as an honor guard, color guard, final salute detail. We volunteer at the VA Hospital and the Buffalo International Airport that has a Freedom Lounge. We distribute food, food boxes to veterans, do news articles. We advise us to new posts. We visit veterans, conduct celebrations of life ceremonies, provide communal ceremonies. As a matter of fact, on the 20th of last month, I almost said this month, last month, I conducted a communal service at the new Western New York National Cemetery in Hartford, New York, which is only 20 miles from Buffalo. And by the way, veterans receive free burials. And when I said free, it's really not free because we've earned it. We've earned it as veterans. But as far as the cost of internment, no, we don't have to deal with that. It's just a matter of paying for funeral services, but not the burial site. So I just wanted to say that.
And Reverend Commander Pierce, I have another question here for you. You mentioned the site, the cemetery where Jesse Clipper is buried. You mentioned that over 6,200 soldiers and Marines are buried there. Could you, or do you know how many of those are fellow African Americans like Jesse Clipper?
No, I don't. You know, and when you talk of the military, a bullet knows no color.
Very
That's
good.
the way it is.
Mm-hmm. Right. This next question goes to Dr. Diane Cookfair. So you've got an article that's been published in the Western New York Heritage Magazine. You have new relationships with the, right. You have relationships now with the Post and with the Reverend Commander there. So what are your or his or the Post's next steps or plans of next steps in continuing to tell the Jesse Clipper story?
Oh, that's a good question, isn't it, Reverend Pierce?
Yes, it is.
We've had these discussions, and my husband entered a note here telling him that one of the things we're doing right now is working on a follow-up article that deals with the early history of the Jesse Clipper American Legion Post number 430, because it was formed right after World War I, and its history is fascinating. And the story hasn't been told, and this was a very brave group of men who, like their namesake, the biggest difference is they came home. A lot of them had moved to Buffalo shortly before the war, just like Jesse Clipper did. And they couldn't get into the White Legion posts. The Legion, the American Legion itself sort of didn't say that, but the posts were allowed to decide which members could get in and which couldn't, and they were not accepting African-American members. So, led by Mosby McAden, who had been a lieutenant in the 92nd Division, they formed a post, and they did some absolutely marvelous things for the African-American community of Buffalo and Western New York. And they were the only post that African-Americans could join for about 20 years. So we're working on an article about that history because we think that's a very important part of the history of the African-American experience here in Buffalo. And as Reverend Pierce said, and please, feel free to kibitz here, we think it would be a great thing if there was a physical location for the post to begin again, so that they could start to do more of they're already doing what outreach they can, but if you have a physical location, you can do children's programming, you can provide, tutoring programs. There's a lot of things you can do, and you can provide a place for the community to meet. It helps to have a center. Anything you'd like to add to that, Reverend Pierce?
No, I think that the community can and will do more in the memory of Jesse Clipper, and also in support of a better society, a better community. And we don't have to settle for the situation we're now in. We can put our resources together, whether we obtain a building through a grant, a donation, or a combination of the two. We have the resources, financial and that out there. So hopefully, dear Lord, let someone hear us that will come forward and say, okay, I'm the person, I will help.
Thank you. Are there any more questions? I don't see any more in the chat box. So before I go on, I want to sort of go back to this slide, and I'm sorry, Audrey, if you go back to that slide with the subscriptions on there, just to reiterate what Dr. Diane was talking about related to the Heritage magazine and the subscription. If you were to go on our website or on our social media pages, we'll have links up. We do presently have links up to get you to this. So if you have an interest in getting this particular edition and future editions, we strongly encourage it. And you can do so by just contacting us or going directly to our website or social media pages. And we have some upcoming some really interesting, unique presentations. Tonight we had, as our kickoff, we had 43 participants, 43 of you join us tonight. And that's exciting and encouraging, and it shows that there's a great interest in these stories, these continued stories that are important to our community and to our people. Our next presentations happening next Tuesday, February the 8th, same time. It's Turning Tables, Radio History, and it features Buffalo Radio's own Lee Pettigrew. And then that's going to be followed by a presentation on the African-American veterans and segregation in the military. The speakers there would be Warren Galloway and Stephen Tedesco, which is timely because, as we all know, that important monument is going to be dedicated this coming on February the 22nd. The ABCs of Buffalo Black History. This featured speaker is docent Sharon Holly, who's also a board member of our commission, and she'll be talking and sharing information related to the Buffalo's Black history. I'm sorry, the tradition keepers, Black storytellers of Western New York, and those things associated with that. And then finally on February the 23rd, Untold Stories of the Underground Railroad in Buffalo. speaker, another board member with the commission, Lily Wiley Upshaw. So we encourage you and your families to join us during this month of Black History. Again, if you're looking for more information, you can always go to our website and or our social media pages. And with that, I again thank Diane, as well as the Reverend and Commander Eugene Pierce for a fantastic, outstanding presentation tonight. And I thank all of you for participating with us tonight. And God bless all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, Terry, for everything you did for this. Thank you, Noel from Western New York Heritage and Reverend Pearson. I just saw a note there from Barbara Miller Williams that said, imagine if we could have more of these discussions.
Yes.
And I couldn't agree more. I think it's very important. I mean, this was a very mixed and different group from different walks of life that came together. And I think now more than ever, it's important for us to talk together and to share information and perspectives. And there's a lot we didn't get to tonight, that some of which is in the article, but I think it's really important to know history and its lessons and how it affects things, and have a dialogue and to present history the way it really happened, not the way some people would like to edit it as having happened.
Amen.
Yes, and I would like to acknowledge my sister, Dr. Aminia Dixon. I saw, there she is. She resides in Meadville, Pennsylvania. She's an educator there, and it's so nice that she was able to Zoom in. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome, welcome, Doctor. Thank you. Thank you. So with that said, I guess we'll leave the Reverend, as all Reverends always get the last word. So his will be the last word. So have a good night, everybody, and thank you for participating.
Thank you.
Take care.
God bless you.
Good night, everybody.